Welcome, everyone. I am Susana Martinez, Director of the Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program at DePaul University. I want to welcome you to this talk on race, restorative justice, and healing. And I want to thank the co-organizers of the Healing Justice Dialogue series for making this event possible. Thank you, Dr. Julie Moody Freeman, Director of the Center for Black Diaspora, Joelle Daly, her Assistant Director, Jessica Williams, and Jennifer Ogumike, student workers. Thank you to Ann Russo, Director of the Women's Center. And thank you, Dr. Maria Ferreira, Director of the Center for Community Health Equity, and Priya Wade, her student worker. Maria will conclude our event tonight and share some announcements with us. I want to acknowledge our co-sponsors, American Studies, Community Service Studies, Critical Ethnic Studies, African and Black Diaspora Studies, Masters in Social Work, and Women and Gender Studies. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our speaker. Fania Davis is a leading national voice on the intersection of racial and restorative justice. She is a longtime social justice activist, civil rights trial attorney, RJ practitioner, writer, and scholar with a PhD in Indigenous Knowledge. In her book, The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice, Black Lives, Healing, and U.S. Social Transformation, published last year in 2019, she defines restorative justice as, quote, a justice that seeks to transform broken lives, relationships, and communities, rather than shatter them further. A justice that seeks reconciliation, rather than a deepening of conflict. A healing justice, rather than a harming justice, end quote. She is the founding director of Restorative Justice of Oakland Youth, RJOY, and the recipient of numerous honors and awards. Our event will be moderated by Tomás Ramírez, an instructor in the Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies program at DePaul. He is the executive director of Semillas y Raices, Seeds and Roots, a nonprofit organization focused on cultural preservation, community healing, and youth development. He facilitates restorative processes for the North Lawndale Restorative Justice Court, the first RJ court of its kind in the nation. Tomás holds a Master's of Science degree from DePaul School of Public Service and is currently working on his PhD in our College of Education. Please make sure to write your questions in the chat tonight for Tomás. And now we will have the pleasure of hearing from Dr. Fania Davis.
Fania, we can't hear you. You're still on mute. Fania, we can't hear you.
Sorry about that. I've done this a zillion times. I still forget to unmute myself. I'm looking a little milky when I look at my image. Can you see me okay? My image?
Yes.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Thank you. Welcome, everyone in the audience. Thank you, Maria, Tomás, Susana, Julie, and thank you, DePaul University, the Center for Black Diaspora, the Women's Center, and the Center for Community Health Equity and Peace, Justice, and Conflict Studies for inviting me to share with you today about race, restorative justice, and healing. And of course, we got to talk about the elections. I want to honor the ancestors of the land where I live, work, and play here in Oakland, California. Oakland is the unceded territory of the Ohlone peoples. And in invoking the original inhabitants of this land, we engage in an act of truth-telling. I don't know where you are, but can you please silently honor and call the names of the original inhabitants of your land. We unsilence a long buried truth when we invoke their names, and that is, this is a post-genocidal land. This is an occupied land. And like the historical harm of slavery, we have yet to fully recognize, take responsibility for, and take reparative action for this massive historical harm and its continuing impacts. I want to honor the souls who have lost their lives due to the injustices laid bare by the coronavirus and by the mismanagement of the coronavirus. I want to honor Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Walter Wallace, and the countless souls whose lives were taken by police terror. I want to honor all those who have lost lives because the knee of white supremacy and terror have been on their neck for the last 401 years. Can we all just take a moment and close our eyes? And let's become aware of our breaths. And can we take 3 breaths together, 3 collective breaths? Thank you. I want to acknowledge you for being here this evening and acknowledge you for creating this Healing Justice series. When I was in law school almost 50 years ago at the University of California, Berkeley, the idea of a healing justice was just not fathomable. The juxtaposition of these 2 words was a bewildering oxymoron. And the idea that lawyers and judges could also be healers was inconceivable at the time. But today we see a sea change. Restorative justice proliferating all over the world, especially the last 16 years, is itself a healing justice. Also, we are witnessing a proliferation of other non-combative, non-oppositional conceptions of our adversarial legal system, whether collaborative law, transformational law rather, spirituality in law, holistic law, therapeutic jurisprudence. I cannot overemphasize how unimaginable this paradigm shift was even a couple of decades ago. My sister Angela Davis has said self-care and healing and attention to the body and to the spiritual dimension, all of this is now a part of radical social justice struggles. In that spirit, I want to do a quick interactive exercise with you. How did you feel after the Biden-Harris team, it was announced that the Biden-Harris team rather, were victorious? How did you feel after the election results finally came in this past Saturday? Take a moment and write a word or 2 in the chat if that's available to you.
Hello, everyone. I'll read some of the answers. People are stating that they're sad for having a nation that is divided. A lot of people are feeling hopeful, relief. Some people are tired, excited, scared. Some people are saying that it's a quick break. A lot of people are cautious, hopeful again, and joyful. A lot of people are concerned with the future. A lot of people are acknowledging that they broke down in tears. Some people feel represented, and some people feel exhausted but happy. Those are some of the answers.
Thank you, Tomás. That covers the full range of emotions, it seems. And now can we, each of us, gesture, offer a physical gesture that expresses that feeling that you just named in the chat. And I will model by saying, I felt celebratory And I felt like a lot of work is needed. So I'm going to gesture celebratory. Yeah. And a lot of work is needed. My gesture is, Okay, can each of you just do that? We'll all do it together and we'll look around the screen to see everybody doing that. Okay. All right. Thank you. So, there was dancing in the streets. Some of you said celebratory, jubilant. Car horns were blaring, people hanging from their windows, beating pots and pans, people screaming for joy. In my neighborhood, we had a socially distanced celebration, which was wonderful, and we were jubilant. The presidency from hell is done. After 4 years and after a nail-biting 3 days, the long national nightmare has finally ended. We have paused the free fall into hell, as Congressperson AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, has said. We're celebratory, but as many of you indicated in your chat responses, it is a mixed bag. We cannot rest easy not knowing what chaos and damage, further damage, the present occupant may cause for the next 74 long days. We can't rest easy knowing that roughly half of the 2020 electorate voted to continue this descent into hell. And I want to address this whole question of the division of our country by race. We've seen a lot of reports and headlines that say the majority of white people in this country voted for Trump. We see reports that say half of the country voted for Trump. And a majority of white people voted for Trump. Not to minimize or diminish the persistent power of white supremacy, the data suggests that this idea that half of the country voted for Trump, the majority of white people voted for his neo-fascist policies, may be an overstatement. First, the 2016 polls projecting a hands down victory for Hillary Clinton, and the 2020 polls projecting a blue wave and a decisive repudiation of Trump's policies, those polls suggest we need to have a healthy skepticism about their accuracy. We will be dissecting this election for years, but exit polls showing nearly half of the country and the majority of white people voted for Trump are not likely accurate for 2 reasons. One, we know that exit polls are based solely on in-person voting and exclude early and mail-in votings. And we know that in-person voting favored Trump, while early and mail-in voting heavily favored Biden. 2, we have to understand that in this country, historically, voter turnout rate is never 100% or even close to it. It hovers between 50 and 60% usually. In other words, we have far more eligible voters than actually those who vote on election days. 2020 brought out record numbers of voters, estimated at about 63% of the eligible voting population. These are levels we haven't seen in about 100 years, it's said, even exceeding the Obama turnouts. So of those 63% of eligible voters who voted, 30% of them voted for Trump and about 33% for Biden. So even if 57% of those who Trump were white, we cannot say it's the same thing as saying that more than half of the white people in this country voted for Trump. I don't know if you get that in math, but again, only 60% of the eligible voting population, white and people of color, voted in the election in the first place. So that's not the same as saying that half of the white people in this country voted for Trump. We don't really know. We don't have the data yet. But if we assume that all of Trump's voters were white, all of his 71 odd million voters were white, that would still be only about 1/3 of the white eligible voters in the nation. The conclusion that 50% of white people in this country voted for Trump must be seen against the backdrop of what we saw with our own eyes in the wake of George Floyd, where the legions marching in 50 states and 200 cities, 2,000 cities, were majority white. It should be seen in the context of polls just a few months ago that showed 60% of white people supported Black Lives Matter. It should be seen in the context of the unprecedented numbers of white people writing and reading anti-racism texts and noticing and eradicating the ways they personally perpetuate structural racism. It should be seen in the context of the surging thousands of white people, tens of thousands, who joined white anti-racist organizations like Showing Up for Racial Justice, Wide Awake, coming since 2016. This data about the exit polls must be seen in the context of all of the universities that are telling the truth about their complicity with slavery and the slave trade. And in the context of all of the statues extolling slavery that are falling and memorials to the enslaved and lynched persons are rising. It should be in the light of the fact that the terms white supremacy is moving from margins to mainstream in the public discourse. It should be seen in the light that systemic racism is now nearly a household word. Biden utters it almost every time that he speaks. It should be seen in the light of the unprecedented developments in the reparations movement. Most 2020 presidential candidates, excluding Biden, supported reparations. Growing numbers of cities have passed legislation creating reparations funds and programs, including Chicago's Police Torture Reparations Fund, initiatives in Charlottesville, Virginia, and Providence, Rhode Island, and Asheville, North Carolina, and the reparations bill recently passed, or in June passed, by the California lawmakers. It should be seen in the context of all of the reimagining public safety initiatives in scores of cities around this nation that are going on right this moment as we sit here. Oakland, for example, where I live, as I said, has cut $15 million from the police budget for this fiscal year, and the city voted to form a reimagining public safety task force to cut funding to the police by 50% by the end of this year. We are also in Oakland reimagining school safety and coming up with a plan that is finding alternative community-based approaches to keeping schools safe. Of course, there's also Minneapolis that is engaged in this process, this unprecedented historical process of reimagining public safety, where Black Lives Matter and where we don't rely so much on police. So the data from the election should also be seen in the context of projects like the New York Times 1619 initiative, which is an indication that we as a nation are finally looking in the mirror, facing the truth that we are a nation born not in liberty, but in terror. The terror of white supremacy, the terror of slavery, the terror of genocide, the terror of land theft, and racial capitalism. All that said, it is undeniable that exit polls show that even after all the misery that Donald Trump has caused, all his misogynistic behavior against women, all the racism he has aroused, all the immigrant families he's destroyed, all the people whose lives were taken by the coronavirus due to his callous mismanagement, roughly those who voted to continue this descent into hell. That's bad enough. It's cause for pause, but it's not the same as saying half the country voted for him. It's not even the same as 67% of white people voted for him. That withstanding, we cannot rest easy knowing what chaos and irreparable damage the incumbent may cause for the next 74 days related to the climate accords and other issues, as I said earlier. About Kamala Harris, it is historic, no doubt, and great cause for celebration to see a woman elected to the vice presidency, and an African American, and a Caribbean American, and an Asian American woman, and a woman from an immigrant family at that. There's no doubt that it was Black people and people of color in general, especially in the swing states, who were decisive in the Biden-Harris victory, whether Arizona, Detroit, and Georgia, Pennsylvania. Yet, we must not forget, it is not presidents, it is not vice presidents, no matter how historic their victory, that shape the larger arc of history. No individual shapes the arc of history. The Democratic Party is a party of capital, allied to the 1%. It is a party of neoliberal policies of deregulation, privatization, austerity, free corporate trade, where tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs, pensions, and homes. It is not the Democratic Party that will shape new futures that are beckoning. They will not lead us in reimagining new public safety futures where Black lives matter. Entire communities united will. It is the climate justice movement, millions of children the world over, who will lead us into new, safe, and verdant futures. It is the immigrant rights movements that will protect children from being kidnapped from their mothers and fathers. It is the LGBTQIA movements and allies who will protect the non-binary people from discrimination and terror. It is the anti-incarceration movement, transformative justice, restorative justice, and healing justice movements generally, led by those most negatively impacted, that will re-envision justice in ways that Black lives matter. It is a movement underway for the next economies that are re-envisioning a different economic system that lovingly centers the well-being of all human and earth beings to replace a racial capitalist system that exalts profit, whiteness, and extreme individualism. It is simply not individuals, presidents, vice presidents, or parties of capital that will bring these changes. Indeed, historically, it has been broad, radically inclusive, multiracial movements that do this, whether the abolitionist movements against slavery, the movements against debt, slavery, and lynching, the movements in the early part of the 20th century that brought us the 8-hour day, Social Security, unemployment, and health benefits, the movements that brought us civil rights in the 1960s, and of course, all the movements of today that are transforming our histories. Indeed, the Biden-Harris victory offers us a moment of celebration, a moment, as was said in the chat. And let's always celebrate our victories, and no matter how small or how large. But this is no time to rest. The work of organizing must continue and intensify. And now with this victory, we have more favorable and even auspicious conditions in which the organizing that is needed. You know, you hear a lot in the press about the Biden-Harris victory being a victory of healing, a victory of empathy, a victory of wisdom. Of course, I agree that Biden is a more mature, if not evolved human being than the present occupant. However, it is not enough to have individuals who are healing in their orientation, individuals who are empathetic, individuals who are wise. All important, necessary, absolutely, but not sufficient. We need institutions, economic institutions, education institutions, health institutions that are healing, empathetic, that are wise. And that is what movements will bring to us, not individuals. Minneapolis gets that justice for George Floyd requires more than prosecuting individual officers. The problem isn't just individual, systemic. Yet prevailing justice only has the capacity to address individual harm, and ineffectively at that. As a perpetrator itself of massive harm, this system is plainly incapable of stopping the killings. So we are in a time of reimagining new futures, both new policing and new justice futures. The nationwide cry to re-envision policing is also a cry to re-envision justice. Beyond a justice that blames, judges, and punishes people, history calls us to imagine justice that transforms both unjust relationships and systems, a healing justice that requires us to transform ourselves as we transform the world. Restorative justice informed truth processes rooted in indigenous wisdoms about humanity, collectivity, interidentity, responsibility, and the earth are our best hope. Today, we hear multiple appeals for truth and reconciliation from Minneapolis, San Francisco here, where I work with that initiative, in Philadelphia and Boston, and from US Congresspersons Barbara Lee and Al Green. We have much to learn from the past truth and reconciliation processes. Over the last 45 years, countries in the global South have used these processes to help them transition from an era of massive human rights abuses to a Western-style democracy. In the last decade, Canada and the US have followed suit with truth processes to address long-standing abuses against Indigenous and African-descended people. In these settings, however, commissions have largely been top-down, quasi-judicial bodies of experts who hold hearings, examine evidence, and develop recommendations and curriculum changes and other reform, police reform, and so forth. Plus, most previous truth processes, including South Africa's favored approaches that centered individual rather than systemic wrongdoing. Though in other times in geopolitical contexts, a top-down truth and reconciliation model may have had some traction in the United States, today truth is where systemic harm is not addressed and where governments don't share power with communities, especially historically marginalized communities, won't work. The way we imagine new futures is crucial. If the way we get there relies on hierarchies of power, we will replicate hierarchy. If the way we get there embodies power over instead of power with, we will reproduce systems of domination. We can't get to a new place in an old way. While current calls for truth and reconciliation gesture toward a more capacious justice, we need processes that reflect the particular insights of these times. Truth processes that are grassroots and restorative justice informed hold the greatest promise. Nothing about us without us is a central tenet, as many of you know, of restorative justice. In an ongoing, radically respectful and inclusive process, we must do this work ourselves. This means in every neighborhood, on every block, everyday people roll up their sleeves and do the challenging and hopeful work of engendering transformed relationships and structures leading into new futures. Peacemaking circles rooted in Tlingit and other indigenous traditions exemplify a shared leadership model whose ethos is communitarian, inclusivist, and accountability-based. Drawing on everyone's wisdom, circles are counter-hegemonic. My organization, the one that I founded, I'm retired from currently, Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, and Community Works West, Impact Justice, Circle Up, and other organizations in the Bay Area have been fostering circles for years. The Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective, a community group based in Oakland, also builds transformative justice responses to child sexual abuse. And they have been cultivating these community pods. These are examples of generative and embodied facilitated spaces where diverse communities can engage in dialogical encounter, deepen trust, reckon with the past, and breathe life into transformed relations and structures of the future so that we can finally heal as a nation. History calls on us not only to build new houses of public safety and justice where Black lives are no longer systematically brutalized and subjugated, we also need new economic structures. The ravages of COVID-19 demonstrates that racial capitalism is incapable of meeting the basic health needs of its citizens. The cases of Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Walter White, George Floyd, Tony McDade, and countless others show it is unable to protect citizens from police terror. Climate catastrophe teaches us that capitalism has neither the ability nor the will to protect our children or the earth. These are each radical, systemic, and relational conditions that must be met with radical systemic and relational remedies. There is so much injustice in this world, caused by colonialism, racial capitalism, slavery, the slave trade, land theft, genocide, structural racism, heteropatriarchy, mass incarceration, xenophobia, and climate catastrophe. We need justice. And for centuries, these iniquitous systems have been enacting unrelenting, unfathomable trauma to our mind, bodies, our families, our communities, our earth. We need healing, not one or the other, not just healing, not just justice, both. If we are to move to a future, this is a non-binary proposition. I explore this warrior healer theme in my book, The Little Book of Race and Restorative Justice. Ultimately, we're being invited to reimagine what it means to be human, living in balance with others and with the earth. Restorative justice circles and transformative justice pods exemplify the kinds of liberatory spaces where we can imagine and practice and envision new relational ways of being now. The future is now. In conclusion, predating and challenging the slave trade, genocide, and racial capitalism, restorative justice is inspired by the notion of justice decolonized. It is rooted in indigenous insights, affirming humans' equal moral worth and dignity, their inter-identity, and their reciprocal responsibility to one another and to the earth. One of the more powerful things that all of us can do today is to hold fast to values of radical respect, interrelationality, and responsibility, while embodying a deep anti-racist, anti-heteropatriarchal, and anti-capitalist consciousness. Restorative justice-informed truth processes offer a way to face and transform history's pain while radically reimagining more beautiful relationships and structures that will be just accommodating and able to serve as a home for all. Thank you.
Thank you so much for those words, Dr. Davis. Before we move on, please acknowledging the way that our elders educate us. Let's take a deep breath and let's really consume that medicine that we get, you know, and reflect. Let's go through that practice. Let's couple deep breaths. Thank you so much. As we are in our journey to be in right relationship, there's a part about reflection. That's the part about respectfully asking questions that are focused on the health, the happiness, the well-being of our communities. That's what a lot of what I'm getting today. And it aligns with a lot of the teachings of my elders. At this point, if people have questions, please start typing them. We'll try to pick a few of them and we'll continue our conversation. Mostly having a lot of people who are very grateful right now and acknowledging.
Thank you.
We have an amazing question from Kelly Taylor to see if you could address how one who works within systems could address them from the inside. For example, doing work with district attorneys in the different district attorneys offices? Let's start with that one.
Sure. I think the first principle that is central is that any restorative justice based project that occurs within the context of the district attorney's office would ideally be community centered, would be community owned, actually would be co-owned with the government, but would be led by community. That's central, because these systems, whether school systems or district attorneys systems, are systems historically of domination. In fact, often systems that have brutalized historically and into the present day people of color and other and people who are, you know, marginalized economically as well. So in order to truly build and envision new futures, we need to take that process outside of a government-led context. And those governmental entities need to share power with communities and not dominate these processes of re-envisioning justice, whether through truth and reconciliation processes or restorative justice, alternatives to incarceration.
Thank you. And I guess there's a little bit of a follow-up to that, which is to see if you could provide some of your experiences or thoughts on restorative justice circles within a community and police departments.
Yes, we have limited experience at this time in police departments. Restorative justice organizations in Oakland have engaged in dialogues with police, like after Oscar Grant was murdered and after Michael Brown, there were community police dialogues. And our young students in schools where we have restorative justice programs have also engaged in circles with police. But beyond that, we have not engaged in a systematic way with police. It's something that we need to do. It's something that other localities are doing. I think Chicago has police community dialogues regular and has engaged in a more systematic way with police officers. Mm-hmm. It's something that that I hope that we can do more of. And of course, I also hope that we continue to continue to reimagine different ways, more restorative ways of ensuring public safety rather than using police officers. And we hope to bring police officers in. Well, for example, let me just tell you, right now we are re-envisioning school safety in the Oakland public system, which is where Our Joy, the organization that I co-founded and directed, did a lot of and does a lot of restorative justice work. And there we are retraining school security officers, or this is what we are proposing. The task force is proposing that we retrain school security officers to learn how to de-escalate in ways that don't require violence or abuse or punitive tactics. And we're talking about doing just a whole bevy of trainings to get them on that page, and also just training rather the entire school community to also build their capacity to address conflict in non-punitive ways.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That makes me feel really good. Very validating to a lot of the work that a lot of my colleagues who are here have been doing. I have a question from Tracy Mabry. I'm sorry for butchering people's names. She's wondering what will be the youngest ages or grades that you see that for restorative practices that can be effectively used.
I don't think any age is too young. You know, when I was working in RJOY and in the schools in Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, the acronym is RJOY, and in the schools of Oakland, one day I was visiting an elementary school on a career day. And of course, you go in along with other professionals and talk about your career. And, you know, so that they can think about what they might want to pursue later on in life. And so I went to different classes, the 10th grade, no, I think it was in elementary school. So 8th grade class, 7th grade class, I just did a slideshow about my background, you know, coming from Birmingham, Alabama, about the civil rights movement of the time, about segregation of the time, and how that led me to become a trial lawyer against racism, civil rights trial lawyer, how that led me to become a restorative justice practitioner ultimately. And I would just use my slideshow and make the presentations and students would have comments. I went into the 3rd grade class and I immediately sensed that there was something troubling the students. 3rd graders, right? So how old are they? 8 or so? And so we basically did a circle right then and there. And for students, young people who had never, well, that school didn't have a restorative justice program. And we were able to surface, you know, what the problem was. And students basically were very unhappy because their normal teacher was on medical leave. And there was a woman, substitute, who happened to be pregnant, that they just weren't feeling, they were missing, basically, they were missing their regular teacher so much, and they weren't always very kind to the substitute teacher. That emerged, you know, in that we did on the spot with these young people. And these 9-year-olds basically apologized to the teacher and the substitute teacher and explained to the substitute teacher why they were feeling the way that they were feeling. And they agreed that they would try to do better. So, I mean, we didn't have to train these kids. We didn't have to prompt them. It was just a perfect, we couldn't have had a circle with humans or children, with humans or our child humans that could have gone any better than that one.
Well, thank you so much. I see a lot of smiley faces. We have a lot of people in our community right now here who are doing work in schools. We have amazing programs like WOW, who are in the house tonight. We have the Alternatives, who's doing a lot of work in Chicago public schools. Chicago, around DePaul, community peacemakers are also here. It's really awesome. I see, it's really beautiful to see you all together and smiling. So we have a question that was first posted by one of the greatest minds that the PAX program, James Derricksey. And James is asking if you could clarify one of the biggest conversations that we have also at DePaul, within the differences between, or the distinction, or even the tensions that at times people might take when picking specific approaches or sites when trying to unscramble transformative justice, restorative justice, and healing justice.
Yeah. Good question. And it gets me into an important really about restorative justice. Very often, especially in the early years, but even also continuing until today, people will say, we don't want restorative justice, we want transformative justice. Restorative justice works with systems, and we don't want to restore the anti-status quo. We want to change we want to change, transform our circumstances. I just have to say that I think it's based on a misguided understanding of what restorative justice is. And, you know, I can understand why some people think that way. And that is because in the early years, the restorative justice movement in this country had racial justice consciousness, which is shocking, right? Because, you know, people in the restorative justice movement purport to want to reform the criminal justice system and to have no consciousness of Black people and other people of color who bear the brunt of the historical inequities of the system is kind of annoying. And I discovered that myself in when I first heard about the restorative justice movement and was kind of shocked by it. I was shocked by it for the reasons I just said earlier. But then it's kind of made sense considering the systemic racism of this country, white supremacy in this country, considering that all movements or so many movements, the peace movement, the environment movement, the women's movement, also began with no racial justice consciousness. And even they began and originated in racist assumptions. So I can see why people on the left, especially radical, think that restorative justice is no radical analysis. It just goes into systems and accepts the assumptions of these systems that have historically brutalized and subjugated people. But that's not the case. It's certainly not for me. I come from a long history of activism, of racial justice activism, from a long history of promoting, of advocating systems change, anti-capitalist systems change, anti-racist and anti-homophobic systems change. And I think the restorative justice movement, or now I don't think, the restorative justice movement is changing with the participation of greater numbers of people of color in the restorative justice movement, in urban areas, with participation of greater numbers of formerly incarcerated people and youth in the restorative justice movement. We're seeing a transformation, and the literature shows this transformation. If you look at the literature of the restorative justice movement, in its first 30 years or so, you will not see a handful of articles, certainly no books that address the subject of racial justice or social justice and restorative justice. That has completely changed now. It's not just my book. There's a book, Colorizing Restorative Justice. There are other books and so many articles now. And the people, when you go to conferences, you will see a completely different complexion of participants at these present day conferences compared to in the past. So all this to say that I think that has given the impression that the justice, that history has given, that has transformed, but that history nonetheless has given the impression to many that the restorative justice movement has no radical analysis, is considered a social service and not a social movement. But with the advent of Black Lives Matter and with the advent of so many people of color coming into the restorative justice movement, that has certainly transformed. Now, transitional justice, so they're both transformative, I think, restorative justice and transformative justice. And then transitional justice, of course, that is an approach to justice that has been also used in the Global South, as I talked about truth and reconciliation processes earlier, to address long histories of massive civil rights abuse. But you can have these that are restorative justice informed, but it happens that transitional justice tends to be punitive justice informed. It tends to, rather than seeking healing, it seeks the vindication of human rights, which has its place. But when they talk about using our current adversarial retributive system to harms of centuries, I am not convinced that that is the most effective way to go. But justice, of course, challenges the fundamental assumptions and the dominant discourse about justice, from a justice that harms, that responds to the initial harm with another harm. But transitional justice does not challenge these assumptions and the dominant discourse about justice. It affirms and continues the punitive ways of doing justice that we see with our criminal justice system. That was a long answer. I hope it made sense.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thanks so much. I have another question that we see manifested in different ways as we are becoming more aware, and we're trying to not occupy space or allow people who have at times lived in the margins to develop their own voice or to actually lead certain movements. But then there's a role about people who might have been part of the mainstream. So we have a question by Kathy Fleming. This states, as a white woman who wants to conduct meetings for real estate investors to discuss racism in housing, I have reached out to community leaders of color. I struggle because most of these leaders are overwhelmed right now. How do I balance making certain that the voices of communities of color are the leaders of this discussion without putting everything on them?
That's a really good question. And maybe you start with just your people and engage in a very self-critical and engage in self-critical discussions about the history of redlining. That article by Ta-Nehisi Coates in The Atlantic would be a good platform for discussion, a good way to begin your discussion. It's important for white people, as you suggested earlier, not to rely on people of color to solely or unduly rely on people of color to do the work of anti-racism. I think it would be awesome you could yourself going into it, with the intention to engage in acts of truth-telling about the inequities and the oppression and other oppressive history of the real estate in this country. With the help of that article, because that article would be really great for your discussion. Ta-Nehisi Coates' The Case for Reparations, which came out a few years ago in The Atlantic. Good luck on that. And thank you for doing that. Because, you don't hear a lot about anti-racism work in the real estate industry. So I think you're doing really pioneering work, and I just want to acknowledge you for that. And find, you may be very savvy in terms of your knowledge of the history of racism within the real estate field of the real estate industry. You may, but if you're not, find out or identify another white person who is savvy, not just about the history of racism in the real estate movement, but the history of racism in this country and of white supremacy in this country. So if you don't feel really confident about that, bring in another from Surge, Showing Up for Racial Justice, or other organizations like Wide Awake. They would be great allies for that. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. As we are starting to wrap up, I have one more question. And I really love this question because it really connects with a lot of the things that you have shared in the past, even in other times where I have heard you speak, which when you talk about your own journey, your own process of transformation, and which is, the question is by Lisa Simon. How do we dismantle our internal monuments to the carceral state? racism, misogyny, and other forms of oppression and subjugation.
Was that internal monuments
Yes.
to all those systems of domination? Wow. I don't, have an easy answer to that. There is no easy answer to that. But first of all, we start by aware. We start by being aware, hyper aware of the ways in which we as individuals might perpetuate these structural oppressions, and whether structural racism or all of the other oppressions that you mentioned. And we find communities, find other people, because we transform ourselves in community. We cannot do it alone. So if you're white, I mentioned Surge showing up for racial justice, which has just grown just unbelievably since George Floyd was killed. 500,000 white people expressed an interest in becoming a member of Surge, and 500 new chapters have sprung up and more. So that would be a great organization to work with and to ally with as a white person in developing strategies for this sort of internal transformation. You're right, those systems outside of us, whether of racism or sexism or heteropatriarchy, or whatever it is, they live inside of us too. You're absolutely right, they live inside of us, and especially we as restorative justice practitioners must seek to upend, identify, and be aware of, first of all, the way those systems live inside of us, and also develop strategies to upend them and transform them.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. As we are wrapping up, I want to ask you, Dr. Davis, if there are any final remarks or anything that you want us to do as community, because then we have an announcements, but you have the last word.
Oh, I think I've said mostly everything, but I guess the final thing I would say is that, or reiterate, because I've already said it, we need to be both warriors and healers. It's so important for us to do, as the last questioner said or suggested, to both heal ourselves and our families and our communities, as well as fight with all we have against systems of oppression. Transform ourselves as we transform the world. Restorative justice offers a toolkit for this kind of internal and for the warrior and the healer strategies that I'm talking about. And whether it's restorative justice or transformative justice or some other form of healing justice that you embrace, I just urge it. I can't overemphasize the importance of doing both the inner work and the outer work. Thank you so much for all that you are and all that you do.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now the call is to practice the realities that we want for the rest of the world.